You think you know the people sitting at your family table, until you learn your daughter might belong to the man who calls himself family. Comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you love powerful stories like this. The photograph was small, yellowed around the edges, and the way it sat in my hands at night felt like holding confession. It was taken years before I was born, a wedding shot, my great-uncle Thomas standing by my grandmother, eyes bright, arm wrapped around her waist. I'd always admired him, the soft laugh, the way he brought sweets to family dinners. But as I stared, something cold in my chest loosened. In the background, a woman I recognized as my wife's distant cousin was cradling a newborn. The baby's features, the slope of the nose, the curl at the lip, looked like my daughter's. I tell you this in a voice that trembles because I didn't want to be the kind of man who needed proof. I still believed in my marriage, still believed my daughter's baby hair and stubborn jaw came from me. But that photo, found tucked behind an old Bible, pulled at a seam I hadn't known existed. I felt dizzy, everything narrowing to a single terrible thought. What if I'd been living a lie? That night I sat by my sleeping child's door and watched the slow rise and fall of her chest. Her breath was steady, innocent. I traced the shape of her ear with a fingertip like it might reassure me, like touch could banish the suspicion. Instead, the whisper in my mind only grew louder. Family dinners used to be warmth and terrible jokes. Afterwards, the laughter seemed to curdle at the edges. People stopped looking me in the eye the way they used to. A cousin would say, "She does look like Thomas, doesn't she?" and then laugh too loudly. My wife's smiles began to tighten. Thomas, calm, smooth, kept bringing little gifts for our daughter, an old silver rattle, a faded book of nursery rhymes. People called it generosity. I began to call it a quiet, rehearsed performance. My daughter's resemblance to him became community gossip. Neighbors who once nodded as I passed now dropped into silence when I walked by. Children at school pointed at my daughter and called her names I hadn't known existed. I saw my little girl's shoulders slump, saw her retreat into silence when other mothers made jokes. The bullying crept toward her like an animal. Soft steps until it pounced. A mean whisper question about who her real father is shouted across the playground. The sting of that moment flattened me. At home, I asked questions wrapped in calm. "Do you see it?" I kept asking my wife, wide eyes honest, voice small. She would say things like, "People will say anything," or "This is ridiculous." But one night, in the kitchen light, she pinched the bridge of her nose and looked at me as if I were a stranger. The silence that followed was not the reassuring kind. It was the hollow silence of something breaking. People think silence is gentle. They are wrong. Our silence became loud. Plates clinked and conversations ended. My wife stopped sharing the small things, the mundane cracks where truth sometimes shows itself. When I asked for simple details about the past, she would change the subject or smile too tightly. My heart stuck in the same rhythm, worry, anger, pleading. I could feel my friends watching to see whether I would explode. I was learning to hold the volcano within. At my daughter's school, racism and cruelty wrapped around her in ugly packages. A teacher mispronounced her name on purpose. A parent mimicked our accent at a picnic, expecting laughter. I remember my daughter staring at the ground while the words hit her like stones. My chest hurt the way it does when you run and can't breathe. I went to the principal, and my complaint was met with bureaucratic sympathy and slow, sympathetic nods that fixed nothing. "Kids can be cruel," they said. Cruelty became the official explanation for daily bruises to her pride. When Thomas finally returned from a trip, the house filled with his quiet, easy presence. He hugged her and called her by nicknames he'd invented. He looked at me with the softness of a man who expects to be loved. I couldn't trust my pulse. The bullying, the racist jibes, the community's muttered judgments, they were building a pressure chamber in my life. I paced, unable to give my daughter the shield she needed. Then something unexpected happened. Aunt Lydia, a woman who'd always been close to my wife, went to a fundraiser and left me a voicemail. Her voice was trembling, low, like she feared being heard. "Meet me," she said. "I have something to tell you, but not here." I arrived at an old cafe, rain cooling the pavement. She slid me a folded paper that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and old perfume. It was a note from years ago, a hospital admission log with dates and initials. Among them, a name appeared beside a delivery, Thomas H. The note was small, grainy, and suddenly the room felt too small to contain my breath. Aunt Lydia's hand shook. I didn't know if I should say, she whispered. She told me about a nurse's hush memory, about how gossip hides in plain sight. Her confession was a slow unwrapping of a wound. My wife, confused, afraid, and Thomas's presence at a time when questions should have been asked. The details were not proof. They were a map of doubt. Still, the map pointed straight at a terrible possibility. I left the cafe with rain on my collar and heat in my face. For the first time, I understood how something could be both plausible and unbearable. I had to know. But how do you put a scalpel to family and not bleed everyone dry? I confronted my wife on a night when the house was only moonlight and small mechanical sighs from the baby monitor. I remember the words. They tumbled out, raw and jagged. I watched her face in the lamplight, pale, then red, then collapsing like a paper figure. She tried to speak and then closed her mouth as though the right words had been lost. Tears made rivers down her cheeks. Her voice that came out sounded not like anger but like someone stripped in. I was ashamed, she said, voice barely there. I didn't know how to stop it. Then Thomas answered my phone. He came over immediately. I wanted to throw him out. Instead, I watched him sit as if he belonged there, hands folded like a man who has always been forgiven. He looked at my daughter and then at me with something like pity. Some things are complicated, he said. He did not deny everything. He told an old story about an affair of younger days, ended in regret. His words were slow and practiced, not a confession, but a tug toward mercy. I felt the floor drop out. The roof caved under a weight I had not suspected. The house, the family, the life I built felt suddenly fragile as a paper lantern. I realized then that this was not only about paternity, it was about power, who gets to write the story of what happened and who gets to be forgiven. The second twist came when I thought the worst had already happened. I had scheduled a paternity test in secret, my hand shaking as I signed forms at a clinic. I told no one. The test, sterile, clinical, felt like a trial. Days crawled. I hovered by the mail like a mun waiting for execution. Then the results came, undeniable, scientific. 2 simple lines I stared at until they burned. The DNA said what I feared. My daughter was biologically Thomas's. I collapsed in the car, not because of numbers on paper, but because of how those numbers rearranged my life. But justice arrived in a form I didn't expect. The whispers and slurs in the neighborhood had crossed a line. A local blogger posted a hateful piece making my daughter a target, using the test as ammunition. The community's cruelty had a voice, and it was loud. What happened next felt like an avalanche rearranging the valley. An unexpected ally stepped forward, my daughter's teacher, Ms. Ortega, who had watched the ugly whispers for months. She had kept records, dates, incidents, names, and when the blog escalated to doxing, she handed everything to a civil rights group and to an attorney she'd volunteered with. There was a legal pushback, defamation letters, cease and desist orders, and neighbors who had once stayed silent were publicly called out. The blogger's site was taken down, advertisers pulled their support, and the local council opened hearings about harassment in schools. It wasn't a court of God. It was a community court that forced people to see their cruelty in public. Thomas, facing exposure and having to face the practical consequences of his past actions, retreated from the facade he'd worn for years. He lost standing at family gatherings, lost a quiet respect he'd used like a shield. The justice was messy, public, and necessary, and for the first time in months, my daughters had lifted without flinching. We rebuilt in weird, tender ways. My daughter's laughter came back like spring, insisting itself after frost. The nightmares of whispers receded. My wife and I, battered and complicated, went to counseling. She told me things I couldn't unhear. Fear, shame, the small decisions that become avalanches. I listened without pretending I had all the answers. Forgiveness did not fall like a sudden rain. It was slow plumbing, careful repairs. We found ways to protect our child that didn't erase the truth. DNA changed nothing about how loved she was, but it changed how some adults behaved toward her. At the hearings, neighbors who cheered cruelty now had to speak to the harm they had caused. Some apologized in public with handshaking, others refused. Watching them, I felt a complicated triumph, not because I had won, but because the truth had forced us all to confront how easily we let evil hide in smiles. Ms. Ortega became our quiet hero. She sat with my daughter, read her books when the world felt sharp, and taught that courage can look like patience. Now, when I tuck my daughter in, I whisper the same thing every night. You are mine in the ways that matter. I mean it. Blood revealed one thing. Our choices revealed another. The story left marks, but also left us with a new kind of honesty. If you stayed this long, I need to ask you, what would you have done if you were been betrayed by people you called family, people you love? Have you ever seen quiet evil hiding behind family smiles? Comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe if you love powerful stories like this.